The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden steps of St. Mary's Church in the frontier town of Cedar Falls. The small congregation had gathered early, their Sunday best a stark contrast to the dusty streets and weathered buildings that surrounded them. Inside the modest chapel, white ribbons adorned the pews, and wildflowers picked from the prairie decorated the altar. It was meant to be the most beautiful day in Eleanor Whitmore's life, but as the minutes ticked by, the whispers grew louder and the glances more pitying. Eleanor stood at the altar in her mother's wedding dress, the ivory silk now feeling like a shroud of humiliation. The lace veil that had once belonged to 3 generations of Whitmore women trembled as her hands shook. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat nervously, his weathered Bible clutched tightly in his hands as he glanced toward the church doors for the 100th time. The groom, Thomas Hartwell, was nowhere to be seen. "Hey there, friend. Before we continue with Eleanor's heartbreaking story, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from." Now let's see what happens next in Cedar Falls. The congregation began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Henderson, the town's most notorious gossip, leaned over to whisper something to her neighbor, her feathered hat bobbing with each animated word. Children fidgeted while their parents exchanged meaningful looks. Eleanor's father, Judge Whitmore, stood rigid beside her, his face a mask of barely controlled rage and embarrassment. Her mother had already begun dabbing at her eyes with a delicate handkerchief, the sound of her quiet sobs echoing in the increasingly tense silence. As another quarter hour passed, it became painfully clear that Thomas Hartwell would not be walking through those church doors. The man who had courted Eleanor for 6 months, who had promised her a life of comfort and respectability, who had spoken of building a future together in the growing town of Cedar Falls, had simply vanished like morning mist. Some said they'd seen him at the poker table the night before, drinking heavily and muttering about debts and obligations. Others whispered that he'd been spotted at the train station before dawn, a single suitcase in hand, and a one-way ticket to San Francisco burning a hole in his pocket. Eleanor felt the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every pitying glance. The dress that had made her feel like a princess now felt like a costume in a cruel play. The flowers in her bouquet, picked fresh that morning from her mother's garden, seemed to wilt before her eyes. The gold band that was meant to symbolize eternal love sat mockingly on the altar, catching the light streaming through the stained glass windows like a taunt from fate itself. Reverend Matthews finally cleared his throat and stepped forward. His voice, usually strong and commanding during Sunday sermons, now carried the weight of uncomfortable duty. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his words careful and measured, "it appears that we will not be celebrating a union today. Perhaps it would be best if we all returned to our homes and kept the Whitmore family in our prayers during this difficult time." The congregation began to file out slowly, some offering awkward condolences to Eleanor's parents, others simply hurrying past with averted eyes. The sound of their footsteps on the wooden floor seemed to echo like thunder in Eleanor's ears. She stood frozen at the altar, unable to move, unable to process the magnitude of her public humiliation. The life she had planned, the future she had dreamed of, had crumbled in the space of a single morning. Judge Whitmore's jaw worked silently as he watched his daughter's world collapse. He was a man accustomed to order, to justice, to things proceeding according to law and custom. This abandonment, this public disgrace, visited upon his family, went against everything he believed in. His wife Margaret moved to Eleanor's side and gently took her arm, whispering words of comfort that seemed to fall on deaf ears. As the last of the congregation departed, Eleanor finally found the strength to move. She walked slowly down the aisle, her train trailing behind her like a white river of broken dreams. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, and the beautiful church that had seemed so full of promise just hours before now felt like a tomb. The flowers, the ribbons, the carefully arranged decorations all seemed to mock her with their cheerful optimism. Outside, the harsh reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. The entire town had witnessed her abandonment. There would be no hiding from this shame, no pretending it hadn't happened. In a place where a woman's reputation was everything, where marriage was often the only path to security and respectability, Eleanor found herself adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The whispers would follow her everywhere. The pitying looks would never cease, and the questions about what she had done to drive Thomas away would haunt her for years to come. She sat down heavily on the church steps, her voluminous skirts spreading around her like a white cloud. The morning that had begun with such hope and excitement had transformed into a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Her parents stood nearby, unsure of what to say or do, their own shock and embarrassment rendering them temporarily speechless. The sound of horses and wagons passing by on the main street seemed muffled and distant, as if the world had suddenly become wrapped in cotton. It was then that she noticed him. A tall figure approached from across the dusty street, his boots making soft sounds against the packed earth. He was a man she had seen around town but never spoken to, someone who kept to himself and rarely participated in the social gatherings that defined life in Cedar Falls. His name was Samuel Crawford, and he owned one of the largest cattle ranches in the territory. He was known as a fair man, honest in his dealings, but solitary by nature. Some said he had come west to escape a tragedy back east. Others claimed he simply preferred the company of cattle to people. Samuel removed his worn leather hat as he approached, revealing hair the color of wheat that had been bleached by countless hours under the prairie sun. His face was weathered and lined, speaking of years spent outdoors in all kinds of weather, but his eyes held a kindness that seemed to cut through Eleanor's despair like sunlight through storm clouds. He was perhaps 10 years older than her 22 years, a man who had clearly seen his share of hardship, but had emerged from it with his dignity intact. He stopped a respectful distance away and stood quietly for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and measured, carrying the weight of genuine sincerity. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his hat held respectfully in his hands, "I couldn't help but notice what happened here today. I want you to know that any man who would abandon a woman like you at the altar is a fool who doesn't deserve the gift he was given." Eleanor looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes, surprised by his directness and the unexpected comfort his words provided. There was no pity in his expression, no judgment, just a simple acknowledgement of her pain and an offer of human kindness in her darkest moment. Samuel shifted his weight slightly, his weathered hands turning his hat brim as he continued. "I know this might not be the time or place for such words, but I feel compelled to speak honestly. I've been watching you from afar for some time now, Miss Whitmore. Not in any improper way, you understand, but with the admiration of a man who recognizes quality when he sees it. You carry yourself with grace and dignity, you're kind to everyone you meet, and you have a strength that I suspect even you don't fully realize." He paused, looking out across the prairie that stretched endlessly beyond the town's borders. "I got too much land and too little company," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of loneliness that resonated with Eleanor's own sense of isolation. "My ranch is prosperous. My cattle are healthy and my land is fertile, but it's a lonely place for a man to live alone. I've been thinking for some time now that what I need is not just a wife, but a partner, someone who could share not just my home, but my life." Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. Was this stranger, this man she barely knew, proposing to her on the very steps where she had just been abandoned? The audacity of it should have offended her, but instead she found herself listening with growing interest. There was something in his manner, something in the honest way he spoke, that made his words seem less like an opportunistic advance and more like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "I know this must seem sudden," Samuel continued, his eyes meeting hers directly. "I know you don't know me well, and I certainly don't expect an answer today, but I want you to know that if you're willing to consider it, I would be honored to offer you not just my name, but a true partnership. My ranch could use a woman's touch, and I believe I could offer you the kind of life where you would be valued and respected, not just as a wife, but as an equal partner in building something meaningful." The offer hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning a chasm. Eleanor's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. Less than an hour ago, she had been a bride-to-be with a clear path laid out before her. Now she was a woman scorned, facing an uncertain future, and an unexpected proposition from a man who seemed to see her not as damaged goods, but as someone worthy of respect and partnership. Samuel's ranch was well known throughout the territory. It was a sprawling operation that covered thousands of acres of prime grazing land, with herds that numbered in the hundreds, and a reputation for producing some of the finest beef in the region. More importantly, Samuel himself was known as a man of his word, someone who treated his workers fairly and conducted his business with integrity. If she accepted his offer, she would not just be escaping the shame of her abandonment, but stepping into a life of purpose and respect. But it was more than just the practical considerations that gave her pause. There was something in Samuel's eyes, something in the way he spoke to her, that suggested this was not just a business arrangement or a marriage of convenience. He seemed to see her as a person, not just a solution to his loneliness, or a way to fulfill social expectations. In a world where women were often treated as property to be traded or ornaments to be displayed, his offer of partnership felt revolutionary. Eleanor's parents had moved closer during Samuel's speech, and she could see the mixture of shock and calculation in their expressions. Her father, ever the pragmatist, was clearly weighing the social and financial advantages of such a union. Her mother looked torn between relief that her daughter might escape the scandal and concern about the hasty nature of the proposal. But Eleanor realized that for the first time in her life, the decision was truly hers to make. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the heat was beginning to build. The church bells, which should have been ringing in celebration of her marriage to Thomas, remained silent. The town was going about its business, but Eleanor could feel the weight of curious stares from windows and doorways. News of her abandonment would spread quickly, and by evening everyone in Cedar Falls would know the story of how Eleanor Whitmore was left at the altar. But perhaps, she thought, that story didn't have to end with her humiliation. Perhaps it could be the beginning of something entirely different, something that she had never even imagined possible. Samuel's offer represented not just escape from her current predicament, but the possibility of a life where she could be more than just someone's wife. She could be a partner, a contributor, someone who helped build something lasting and meaningful. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like the prairie sun, but for the first time since Thomas's absence had become undeniable, Eleanor felt a spark of something that might have been hope. The man standing before her was offering her not just his name and his protection, but the chance to write a new story for herself, one where she was not the victim of someone else's betrayal, but the author of her own destiny. As she looked into Samuel's patient, honest eyes, Eleanor began to realize that perhaps Thomas Hartwell's abandonment was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something far better than she had ever dared to dream. The prairie stretched out beyond the town like an ocean of possibility, and for the first time in hours, Eleanor felt like she might be ready to sail into that vast unknown, not as a refugee from scandal, but as a pioneer of her own future. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of possibility and the promise of a life that neither of them had planned, but both might be brave enough to embrace. In the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, and the wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers across the endless expanse of the American frontier, where anything seemed possible for those bold enough to reach for it. Samuel waited patiently, his hat still in his hands, his expression calm but hopeful. He had made his offer honestly and completely, holding nothing back. Now it was up to Eleanor to decide whether she was ready to trade the familiar pain of her current situation for the uncertain promise of something entirely new. The choice was hers, and hers alone to make. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the stays of her corset tight against her ribs, the weight of her mother's wedding dress suddenly feeling less like a burden and more like armor. She had been raised to be a proper lady, to follow the prescribed path of courtship, marriage, and motherhood. But life had just shown her that the prescribed path was not always reliable, and perhaps it was time to consider a different route entirely. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows on the church steps, where Eleanor sat contemplating the most important decision of her life. Behind her, the empty church stood as a monument to broken promises and shattered dreams. Before her, a man offered not just rescue from her immediate predicament, but the possibility of a partnership that could transform them both. The choice between the known shame of her current situation and the unknown promise of Samuel's offer would define not just her immediate future, but the entire trajectory of her life. As the wind picked up, carrying with it the endless possibilities of the American frontier, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The tears had stopped, the trembling had ceased, and in their place, she felt the first stirrings of something that might have been courage. The woman who had stood at the altar that morning, waiting for a man who would never come, was already becoming someone different, someone stronger, someone ready to write her own story in the vast, unforgiving, but ultimately promising landscape of the American West. The decision, when it came, would change everything. But for now, in this moment suspended between heartbreak and hope, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be not just someone's abandoned bride, but someone's chosen partner. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, and as she looked into Samuel's patient, honest eyes, she began to believe that perhaps the best chapters of her life were still waiting to be written. Samuel's ranch lay 15 miles west of Cedar Falls, a sprawling operation that had taken him 8 years to build from nothing into one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. The main house was a sturdy 2-story structure built from local timber and stone, designed to withstand the harsh prairie winters and the scorching summer heat. It sat on a slight rise overlooking the valley where his cattle grazed, with a view that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The house itself reflected Samuel's practical nature and his success as a rancher. The rooms were spacious and well-appointed, with furniture that was built to last rather than to impress. The kitchen was large and efficient, designed for feeding not just a family, but the ranch hands who worked the vast property. There was a library filled with books on agriculture, animal husbandry, and the classics that Samuel had brought with him from his previous life back east. Most importantly, there was a sense of permanence about the place, a feeling that it was built not just for today, but for generations to come. Eleanor had visited the ranch once before, as part of a church social where the congregation had been invited to see one of the territory's most successful operations. She remembered being impressed by the obvious prosperity of the place, but more than that, she had been struck by the way Samuel treated his workers. He knew every man by name, asked about their families, and paid wages that were fair and reliable. It was clear that this was not just a business to him, but a community that he had built with care and intention. The more Eleanor thought about Samuel's offer, the more she realized that it represented something far more significant than just escape from her current humiliation. Thomas Hartwell had offered her a conventional marriage in town, where she would have been expected to manage a household, raise children, and participate in the social activities that defined respectable society. It would have been a comfortable life, but ultimately a limited one, where her role would have been clearly defined and her opportunities for growth and contribution would have been constrained by social expectations. Samuel's offer was entirely different. A ranch of that size and complexity required not just a housekeeper or a hostess, but a true partner who could contribute to every aspect of the operation. Eleanor had grown up on her father's smaller property outside of town, and she knew how to manage livestock, keep accounts, and handle the 1,000 details that went into running a successful agricultural operation. More than that, she had ideas and ambitions that had never had an outlet in the conventional life that had been planned for her. The thought of being able to contribute meaningfully to something larger than herself was intoxicating. Instead of spending her days managing social calls and organizing church socials, she could be involved in breeding programs, land management, and the business decisions that would determine the ranch's future. She could use her education and intelligence in ways that would make a real difference, not just in her own life, but in the lives of everyone who depended on the ranch for their livelihood. But beyond the practical considerations, there was something about Samuel himself that drew her attention. In the brief interactions she had observed between him and others, she had noticed a quiet strength and integrity that was rare in her experience. He was not a man who needed to prove himself through bluster or aggression. His reputation spoke for itself, and he seemed comfortable with who he was and what he had accomplished. There was a steadiness about him that felt like solid ground after the earthquake of Thomas's abandonment. Eleanor realized that she had been holding her breath, and she slowly exhaled as she looked up at Samuel. The sun was now high enough that she had to shade her eyes to see his face clearly, but what she saw there was patience and understanding. He was not pressuring her for an immediate answer, not trying to take advantage of her vulnerable state. He had made his offer honestly and completely, and now he was giving her the space and time she needed to consider it properly. "Mr. Crawford," she said finally, her voice stronger than she had expected it to be, "your offer is both generous and unexpected. I find myself in a position I never imagined I would face, and I'm grateful for your kindness in this difficult moment, but such a decision cannot be made lightly, especially under these circumstances." Samuel nodded, his expression showing that he had expected nothing less. "Of course, Miss Whitmore. I would think less of you if you were to make such an important decision in haste. Take all the time you need. My offer will stand, and there is no pressure for you to decide today or tomorrow or even next week. When and if you're ready to consider it seriously, I'll be honored to discuss it further." Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her. The fact that he was not trying to rush her into a decision, that he understood the magnitude of what he was proposing, only reinforced her growing sense that this man was fundamentally different from Thomas Hartwell. Thomas had been charming and attentive during their courtship, but there had always been an underlying sense that he was performing, playing a role that he thought would win her affections. Samuel's approach was entirely different, honest, direct, and respectful of her autonomy. However, Samuel continued, I do want you to know that my offer comes with no conditions or expectations beyond those of a true partnership. If you were to accept, it would be because you chose to, not because you felt you had no other options, and if you were to decline, I would respect that decision completely and would never mention it again. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Eleanor felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. For the first time since she had realized that Thomas was not coming, she felt like she could breathe properly. The panic and desperation that had threatened to overwhelm her were being replaced by something that felt almost like calm. She was still facing an impossible situation, but at least now she had options, and more importantly, she had time to consider them properly. Eleanor's mother approached cautiously, her face still showing the strain of the morning's events. Eleanor, dear, she said softly, perhaps we should go home now. You need to get out of that dress and have something to eat. This has been a terrible shock, and you need time to rest and recover. Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she felt. The emotional roller coaster of the morning had drained her completely, and the thought of getting out of the wedding dress and into something comfortable was appealing. But as she started to rise from the church steps, she realized that she didn't want to leave things unresolved with Samuel. Mr. Crawford, she said, turning back to face him, would it be possible for me to visit your ranch sometime in the next few days? Not to give you an answer, but to see the place again and to understand better what kind of life you're offering. I think I need to see it with new eyes before I can make any kind of decision. Samuel's face lit up with what might have been relief. Of course, Miss Whitmore. You would be welcome any time. Perhaps you could come for dinner later this week. That would give you a chance to see the operation and to meet some of the people who work there. I think you would find it interesting, regardless of what you ultimately decide. Eleanor felt a small smile tug at the corners of her mouth, the first genuine smile she had managed since the morning began. I would like that very much. Shall we say Thursday evening? That would give me time to adjust to my new circumstances. Thursday evening it is, Samuel agreed, replacing his hat on his head. I'll send a wagon for you at 5 o'clock, if that's agreeable. And Miss Whitmore. He paused, his expression serious. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I have the utmost respect for your strength and dignity today. Not every woman could have handled such a situation with such grace. As Samuel walked away, his boots making soft sounds in the dust, Eleanor felt something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon. Hope. Not the naive hope of a young woman planning her wedding, but the more mature hope of someone who was beginning to understand that life rarely went according to plan, but that sometimes the unexpected paths could lead to destinations far better than anything that had been originally imagined. Her parents flanked her as they walked slowly toward their carriage, and Eleanor could feel their concern and confusion radiating from them like heat from a stove. They had expected to be celebrating their daughter's wedding today, and instead they were dealing with public humiliation and an unexpected proposal from a man they barely knew. But as they helped her into the carriage, Eleanor realized that for the first time in her adult life, she was facing a decision that was truly her own to make. The ride home passed in relative silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts about the morning's events. Eleanor stared out at the familiar landscape of Cedar Falls, seeing it with new eyes. The town that had been her entire world suddenly seemed smaller, more confining. Beyond its borders lay the vast expanse of the prairie, and somewhere out there was Samuel's ranch, representing possibilities she had never even considered. As they pulled up to the family home, Eleanor felt the weight of her wedding dress like chains around her body. She needed to get out of it, to shed the symbol of her broken dreams, and figure out who she was going to be now that her carefully planned future had evaporated. But as she climbed the steps to the front porch, she realized that the woman who emerged from that dress would be different from the one who had put it on that morning. She would be someone who had faced public humiliation and survived, someone who had been offered an unexpected chance at a different kind of life, someone who was finally free to make her own choices about her future. The house felt different as she entered it, as if the morning's events had somehow changed the very air inside. Her mother immediately began fussing over her, wanting to bring her tea and something to eat. But Eleanor found that what she really wanted was solitude. She needed time to think, to process what had happened, and to begin imagining what her life might look like if she chose to accept Samuel's extraordinary offer. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her was still wearing a wedding dress, but she was no longer a bride. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her eyes were red from crying, but there was something in her expression that hadn't been there that morning. It was a look of determination, of someone who had been tested and had found reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The wedding dress came off like a chrysalis being shed, and as Eleanor hung it carefully in her wardrobe, she realized that she was also hanging up the version of herself that had put it on that morning. The woman who emerged, dressed in a simple day dress and with her hair loosely braided, was someone new, someone who had choices to make and a future to define for herself. Thursday evening could not come soon enough. Eleanor found herself thinking constantly about Samuel's ranch, about what it would be like to be a true partner in such an operation, about the possibility of building something meaningful and lasting with someone who saw her as an equal rather than an ornament. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Thomas's abandonment, as painful as it had been, might have been the best thing that could have happened to her. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Whitmore was free to choose her own destiny. And as she looked out her bedroom window toward the western horizon where Samuel's ranch lay waiting, she began to believe that the best chapters of her story were still to be written. The days between Sunday and Thursday passed with agonizing slowness for Eleanor. The town of Cedar Falls buzzed with gossip about her abandonment at the altar, and she found herself the subject of pitying looks and whispered conversations wherever she went. Some of the townspeople were genuinely sympathetic, offering words of comfort and support. Others seemed to take a perverse pleasure in her misfortune, as if her public humiliation somehow validated their own choices or confirmed their suspicions about the reliability of men in general. Eleanor's mother, Margaret, spent most of Monday in bed with what she claimed was a sick headache, but which Eleanor suspected was actually acute embarrassment. Her father, Judge Whitmore, threw himself into his work with even more intensity than usual, as if he could somehow restore the family's reputation through sheer force of judicial authority. The house felt heavy with unspoken tension and the weight of dashed expectations. But as the initial shock began to wear off, Eleanor found herself feeling something unexpected. Relief. The life she had planned with Thomas had been comfortable and conventional, but it had also been predictable and limiting. She would have been Mrs. Thomas Hartwell, wife of a successful merchant, mother to his children, hostess at his dinner parties. It would have been a respectable life, but not necessarily a fulfilling one. Now suddenly she was free to consider possibilities that had never been available to her before. Samuel's offer represented not just escape from her current predicament, but the chance to be something more than she had ever imagined possible. The more she thought about it, the more excited she became about the prospect of visiting his ranch and seeing firsthand what kind of life he was offering. Tuesday brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Mrs. Henderson, the town's most notorious gossip. She arrived at the Whitmore house under the pretense of offering comfort and support, but Eleanor could see the gleam of curiosity in her eyes. Mrs. Henderson was clearly fishing for details about what had happened and what Eleanor planned to do next. "My dear Eleanor," Mrs. Henderson said, settling herself in the parlor with the air of someone who planned to stay for a while, "I simply had to come and see how you're holding up after that terrible business on Sunday. The whole town is talking about it. You know, such a shocking thing for a man to do, abandoning his bride at the altar like that. Why, in my day, such behavior would have been grounds for a duel." Eleanor served tea with steady hands, determined not to give Mrs. Henderson the satisfaction of seeing her distress. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Henderson. It was certainly unexpected, but I'm managing well enough." "Oh, my dear, you're being so brave about it all," Mrs. Henderson continued, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "But what will you do now? I mean, at your age, and with this scandal? Well, it's not as if eligible men are growing on trees in Cedar Falls. Perhaps you'll have to consider moving away, starting fresh somewhere where people don't know what happened." Eleanor felt a flash of anger at the woman's barely concealed malice, but she kept her voice level. "I haven't made any definite plans yet, Mrs. Henderson. I'm taking time to consider my options carefully. Options? Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. What options could there possibly be? Unless... Her eyes narrowed with sudden interest. I did hear the most interesting rumor yesterday. Someone said they saw you talking to Samuel Crawford after the incident. Surely you're not considering anything foolish in that direction? Eleanor set down her teacup with deliberate care. Mr. Crawford was kind enough to offer his condolences. I found his words comforting during a difficult time. Condolences? Mrs. Henderson leaned forward eagerly. Is that what they're calling it now? My dear girl, you must be careful. A man like Samuel Crawford doesn't approach a woman in your situation out of pure kindness. He's been alone on that ranch for years, and everyone knows he's been looking for a wife. A woman in your compromised position might seem like an easy target for his advances. Eleanor felt her temper rising, but she forced herself to remain calm. I think you underestimate both Mr. Crawford's character and my own judgment, Mrs. Henderson. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some correspondence to attend to. Mrs. Henderson left in a huff, clearly disappointed that she hadn't been able to extract more gossip from her visit. But her words stayed with Eleanor long after she had gone. Was that how the town saw her now? As damaged goods, vulnerable to the advances of any man who might take advantage of her situation? The thought was both infuriating and motivating. She would show them all that Eleanor Whitmore was nobody's victim. Wednesday brought a letter from her cousin Sarah in Denver, who had heard about the wedding disaster through the network of family correspondence that connected frontier communities. Sarah's letter was full of sympathy and outrage on Eleanor's behalf, but it also contained an interesting offer. Dearest Eleanor, the letter read, I am absolutely furious on your behalf about Thomas Hartwell's despicable behavior. What kind of man abandons his bride at the altar? You are well rid of him, though I know that doesn't make the humiliation any easier to bear. If you need to get away from Cedar Falls for a while, you are more than welcome to come and stay with us in Denver. James has connections in the business community here, and I'm sure we could help you find a respectable position as a governess or companion to a wealthy family. It might be just the fresh start you need. Eleanor read the letter twice, considering her cousin's offer carefully. Denver was a growing city with opportunities that didn't exist in a small frontier town like Cedar Falls. She could disappear into the anonymity of urban life, reinvent herself as someone with no scandalous past, and build a quiet, respectable life as a working woman. It was a safe option, a way to escape the gossip and speculation that would follow her in Cedar Falls for years to come. But, as appealing as the offer was, Eleanor found herself thinking instead about Samuel's ranch, about the possibility of being a partner rather than an employee, about building something meaningful rather than simply surviving. The safe path had its attractions, but it also felt like giving up, like allowing Thomas Hartwell's betrayal to define the rest of her life. Thursday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Eleanor spent extra time choosing her outfit for the evening, finally settling on a deep blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes and a matching jacket that was both practical and flattering. She wanted to look her best, but she also wanted to dress appropriately for a working ranch. As 5 o'clock approached, Eleanor found herself growing increasingly nervous. This visit would determine the course of her entire future, and the weight of that responsibility felt almost overwhelming. But when she heard the sound of wagon wheels in the drive, she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out to meet whatever destiny awaited her. Samuel was driving the wagon himself, and he climbed down to help her up with the easy grace of a man who was completely comfortable with horses and machinery. He was dressed in his best clothes, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a jacket that had clearly been brushed and pressed for the occasion. But there was nothing artificial about his appearance. He looked like exactly what he was, a successful rancher who had taken care to present himself well. Miss Whitmore, he said, tipping his hat as he helped her into the wagon. Thank you for accepting my invitation. I hope you'll find the evening informative, regardless of what you ultimately decide. The ride to the ranch took about an hour, and Eleanor was grateful for the time to talk with Samuel in a relaxed setting. Away from the drama and emotion of Sunday morning, she was able to see him more clearly. He was an intelligent man with a dry sense of humor and a deep knowledge of the land and the cattle business. He spoke passionately about his plans for expanding the ranch, about new breeding techniques he wanted to try, about the challenges and opportunities facing ranchers in the territory. But more than that, He listened to her opinions and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and ideas. When she mentioned some of the agricultural innovations she had read about in the farming journals her father subscribed to, Samuel's eyes lit up with interest. When she asked questions about the business side of ranching, he answered them seriously and completely, treating her as someone capable of understanding complex financial and logistical concepts. By the time they reached the ranch, Eleanor was feeling more relaxed and confident than she had in days. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, and the ranch buildings looked warm and welcoming in the evening light. Samuel's house was even more impressive than she remembered, with wide porches and large windows that would let in plenty of natural light. It looked like a home where a family could be happy and prosperous. Samuel introduced her to his foreman, Miguel Santos, a weathered man in his 50s who had been with the ranch since its early days. Miguel's wife, Rosa, served as the ranch's cook and housekeeper, and she had prepared a dinner that was both delicious and elegant. The conversation around the table was lively and interesting, covering everything from cattle prices to territorial politics to the latest news from back east. Eleanor found herself relaxing completely for the first time since Sunday morning. These were good people, honest and hard-working, and they treated her with respect and warmth. More importantly, she could see how much they respected Samuel and how much he valued their contributions to the ranch's success. This was not a man who ruled through fear or intimidation, but someone who had built a community based on mutual respect and shared goals. After dinner, Samuel took her on a tour of the ranch buildings. The barns were well maintained and efficiently organized. The equipment was in excellent condition, and the livestock looked healthy and well cared for. But what impressed Eleanor most was the obvious pride that Samuel took in what he had built. This was not just a business to him, but a life's work, something he had created from nothing, through years of hard work and careful planning. As they walked back toward the house, Samuel stopped on a small rise that overlooked the entire valley. The moon was rising, casting silver light across the grassland where hundreds of cattle grazed peacefully. In the distance, the mountains rose like dark sentinels against the star-filled sky. "This is what I'm offering you, Eleanor," Samuel said quietly, using her first name for the first time. "Not just a house or a title, but a chance to be part of something larger than either of us could build alone. I know it's not the life you planned, and I know it would mean taking a considerable risk on a man you barely know, but I believe we could build something remarkable together, something that would last long after we're gone." Eleanor stood beside him in the moonlight, feeling the vastness of the prairie around them and the weight of the decision she had to make. The life Samuel was offering was nothing like what she had planned with Thomas. It would be harder, more demanding, full of challenges and uncertainties that a conventional marriage would never present. But it would also be more meaningful, more fulfilling and more truly her own than anything she had ever imagined possible. "Samuel," she said finally, her voice steady and sure, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Are you offering me this partnership because you genuinely believe I could contribute something valuable to your ranch, or are you simply being kind to a woman in a desperate situation?" Samuel turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Eleanor, I've been watching you for months, long before what happened on Sunday. I've seen how you handle yourself in difficult situations, how you treat people with kindness and respect, regardless of their station in life, how you think through problems and come up with practical solutions. I've seen your intelligence, your strength, and your integrity. I'm not offering you this partnership out of pity or kindness. I'm offering it because I believe you would make me a better man, and this ranch a better place." Eleanor felt something settle into place inside her chest, like a key turning in a lock. This was her answer, her choice, her future. "Then yes," she said, her voice clear and strong in the prairie night. "Yes, I will marry you, Samuel Crawford. I will be your partner in every sense of the word." Samuel's face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance, making him look younger and more carefree than she had ever seen him. "Eleanor," he said, taking her hands in his, "you've just made me the happiest man in the territory. I promise you won't regret this decision." As they stood together on that moonlit hill, looking out over the land that would soon be theirs to share, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness that she had never experienced before. This was where she belonged, not as someone's abandoned bride or someone's convenient wife, but as a true partner in building a life that would be entirely their own creation. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in the same church where Eleanor had been abandoned, but this time the ceremony was small and intimate, attended only by family and close friends. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress instead of her mother's wedding gown, and Samuel's vows were heartfelt and genuine, promising not just to love and honor her, but to respect her as an equal partner in all their endeavors. As they exchanged rings and sealed their partnership with a kiss, Eleanor realized that Thomas Hartwell's abandonment had not been the end of her story, but the beginning of something far better than she had ever dared to dream. The woman who walked out of that church as Mrs. Samuel Crawford was not the same person who had been left at the altar 3 weeks earlier. She was stronger, more confident, and ready to embrace a future that would be entirely of her own making. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Eleanor's ideas about breeding and land management proved invaluable, and her business acumen helped expand their markets and increase their profits. But more than that, their partnership grew into a love that was based on mutual respect, shared goals, and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful together. Years later, when people asked Eleanor about her first wedding day, she would smile and say that it was the luckiest day of her life, not because she had found love, but because she had found herself. The woman who had been abandoned at the altar had discovered that she didn't need to be rescued. She needed to be recognized for who she truly was. And in Samuel Crawford, she had found not just a husband, but a partner who saw her potential and gave her the freedom to become everything she was meant to be. The vast prairie that had once seemed empty and intimidating became home, and the ranch that had started as Samuel's dream became their shared legacy. Eleanor Whitmore Crawford had learned that sometimes the best destinations are the ones you never plan to reach, and that the most meaningful journeys begin not with careful planning, but with the courage to step into the unknown and trust that you have the strength to handle whatever you might find there.